Climify is independent of climate designers. The views expressed on Climify are solely those of the host, Eric Benson, and guests of each episode, and do not represent the views of the climate designers. Let's be real. The status quo has created a lot of the world's problems, and we can't rely on business as usual to get us out of this mess we're in. That's why we're partnering with Think NATO this season. It's a dead simple 4-step process to blow open conventional thinking and get to truly unique and innovative ideas. It's not about finding the perfect answer. It's about starting with the right questions, pushing the edges, and then taking action. You can learn more about Think NATO at thinknato.com. That's ThinkNADO.com. Think NATO, the positive action engine. Hey, it's Eric. Welcome to another episode of Climify. It's the final episode of this season where we focused on climate optimism. So far this season, we've discussed strategic optimism, conditional optimism, complacent optimism, active optimism, and how optimism isn't just an attitude, it's a mindset. As Anne-Therese Gennari said, it's something we can show up for. However, to remain optimistic, we also learned that we need to be empathetic, open, and remain curious. It's something we need to work on and work for. We need to help build a strong community around it. The more people we invite into our community of action, the stronger it will be. In this final episode, we talk about a different optimism altogether, apocalyptic optimism, with Dr. Dana Fisher from American University. No, apocalyptic optimism has nothing to do with The Walking Dead or being excited about building a dope bunker to survive climate shocks. It's about being realistic about where you are. And, well, I don't want to spoil it, so you'll just have to listen to the rest of the episode. But before we dig into that, I wanted to share a bit more about Dr. Dana Fisher. Dana Fisher is a speaker and author who writes about activism, democracy, and climate policy. She is the director of the Center for the Environment, Community, and Equity, and a professor in the School of International Service at American University. She is also a non-resident senior fellow with the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution and the chair of the Political Sociology section of the American Sociological Association. Her most recent book is called Saving Ourselves: From Climate Shocks to Climate Action. She has published 7 books and more than 80 chapters in peer-reviewed articles, including ones that have been in Nature, Science Advances, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. She has appeared on television channels like ABC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and various programs on NPR, BBC, and the CBC. Her words have appeared in popular media, including The Washington Post, Slate, Time Magazine, Political, The Nation, Teen Vogue, The Hill, and American Prospect. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an AB from Princeton University. So yes, we are going to be talking about some politics on this episode, specifically American politics. So if you're not feeling that today, just hit pause, come back a different day. Trust me, what Dana has to say is worth it. Dr. Dana Fisher, welcome to Climify. Happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I have to say I'm so thrilled to be part of this season. It's awesome.
Yeah, you have a good amount of amazing people coming in front of you and a lot of different perspectives on our theme. And so that's why you're here with your perspectives on everything. And I'm wondering if we can just get right to what I thought was, first of all, an amazing term, which is apocalyptic optimists. And I was drawn right away when I saw your TED Talk. So, can you talk about what that means and how you got to where you are in that viewpoint?
Absolutely. Okay, so I call myself an apocalyptic optimist, but I wasn't always that way. I mean, that's actually the first line of my TED Talk, but I mean, I say it because it's actually true, but so I used to actually be more, following the theories that suggested that technology could save us from the climate crisis. And so I did my PhD in Madison, Wisconsin. When I did it, my perspective was all about how we could like transform the technological processes to stop the climate crisis, and I wrote about climate change, but I looked at a lot of environmental degradation in my work, and it was always very much thinking about how we get to these technological innovations and what pivots we could use to try to encourage businesses to change their policies and to change their practices. But so I finished PhD now 25 years ago,
Oh, wow.
and unfortunately, well,
It's your
24 and a half
anniversary.
years ago. It's just about my anniversary. Yeah. So
Yeah,
that
it's a
book,
big
actually, the sad thing is that book which came out of my dissertation called National Governance in the Global Climate Change Regime, which was about the Kyoto Protocol, which is like ancient history of climate.
yeah,
And many people, it's funny because I do a lot of media and many of the journalists have never even heard of it because it's
really.
like, what is, yeah, well, we'll talk. That's a whole different
Millennial,
conversation.
yeah, reporters.
Exactly. Don't know their history, but the thing that's important to note here, so I really was that was where my perspective, and I really thought that we were seeing it in practice in a lot of ways when we looked at the realities of the world, particularly looking at the US, like advanced industrialized nations. Unfortunately, over time, as I continued to study climate policymaking, it became increasingly clear that we were not on a path to limit the climate crisis. We're certainly not on a path to stop the climate crisis, and moreover, we were nowhere near the systemic changes that were needed. And so, as I moved forward in doing my work, it became clear to me that it was time to get true to myself about where I was, and I ended up writing this paper with a good friend and colleague, Andrew Jorgensen, on anthroshift, which I know we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And in it, I started thinking about the reality of the situation. So the reality of the situation, the reality of the climate crisis is it's bad, it's getting worse, and nothing we've done so far has come anywhere near where we need to go to stop the problem. We are going to have a long, hot summer. We are going to have a horrible hurricane season. I realize that as of today, I understand that the president has stopped lots of the monitoring, so we will not
Yeah.
know about the horrible storms until after they hit and people's lives are lost. You can't actually just stop storms by not paying attention to them or monitoring them, just like you can't stop climate change by doing that. So things are getting worse, and being an apocalyptic optimist is basically about being realistic about where we are, the path that we are on, and understanding that it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I do believe that we can save ourselves from the climate crisis. That's the optimism part, but it's embedded in the reality of the situation we're in now. And one
Huge.
of the things that I've thought a lot about as I've, come to terms with being an apocalyptic optimist is that I recognize that in a lot of ways, there are many people who are out there saying, oh, no, no, it's okay. Oh, let's talk about the silver lining. And sure, there are good things happening in the world, but there's a lot of bad stuff happening in the world. And if we're not realistic about it, what happens is people get caught off guard and it opens up opportunities for misinformation to come in to
Yes.
confuse people. And when that happens, it makes it a lot harder to be able to understand what's needed to stop the problem, particularly around climate change.
Well, do you remember the year or the moment where you decided you were an apocalyptic optimist? Was there something that happened?
Yeah, it was called the COVID pandemic.
Where okay.
I mean, so when COVID was coming, so what was that? That was the beginning of 2019.
Yeah.
So I had actually just published my last book, which was called American Resistance. I was about to do this exciting book tour in Europe. I had all these cool talks planned, and I was teaching an environmental sociology course, which I used to teach every year when I was at Maryland. And in my course, there's a whole section on risk and risk perception, and I teach Ulrich Beck's work. If you've ever read him, Risk Society. So Ulrich Beck is awesome. Sadly, very relevant today, and it's all about how a perception of risk can really drive social change. in a lot of ways, which is part of the theory of the anthro shift. And anyway, so we're reading this book. And as we're reading the book, I always would try to take like real world situations for my lectures to add them in and information for what was going on in the world. So, people were talking about, this thing that might be a pandemic that was out of China. You may have heard of it. And like it might come to the United States, might not. And so this is happening right as we're reading this book. And I remember the day that I was supposed to give the lecture on Risk Society, a good friend of mine from Japan sent me an email and he said they just shut down our schools.
Oh God.
I know. And I was like, what? And so then I went online. I'm like, I got to get some information about that. And it was the same week that I don't know if you remember, but there were all these folks in Italy who
Yeah.
posted these YouTube videos about how they
Yes.
got locked into specific provinces and they weren't allowed to pass because they did a lockdown.
Yes, I do
And
remember that.
so I showed these videos to my students and it became clear to me that we were in trouble. And it became clear to me that first of all, everybody had been focusing like everybody was looking at one thing and all of a sudden this pandemic came and nobody was focusing on it and that we had to be realistic about where we were if we were going to stop it. Now I remember, and just it was just funny because at that time, I started like talking about it at the dinner table all the time. I have two kids and after like a couple days of me being like, "Oh my god, do you know what they did today? Let me tell you what's going on in Europe. Let me tell you what's going on in Asia." I was banned from discussing
Yeah.
COVID anymore at the dinner table because it was freaking out my kids
Yeah.
and my husband too. So everybody's getting freaked out and they're like, "It's enough, okay?" And then, they shut down schools and it was beautiful because they shut them down for an extended spring break. I don't know what it was like where you guys were, but
Yeah.
yeah. So we had this extended break. It was like 2 weeks is all we need. We're going to flatten the curve and everybody will be back to
Yeah.
school. And I remember when we went for spring break and I said to my students, I don't know if I'm going to see you again. And everybody's
Mm,
like, oh, come on.
yeah. Be
And that
optimistic.
was the last time I saw them. So that was, and that was
Yeah.
it. So I mean, I think so COVID happened and and we had written this theory of anthro shift, which was all about how risk can actually pivot and make social change happen, which in a lot of ways it builds quite a bit off of risk society, but has kind of some new components of it, particularly this multi-directionality, which is this idea that uh, the interactions between the state, the market, and civil society can shift but they can also shift back. And so as COVID was happening, I got asked to write this paper about anthro shifts in a warming world, which was specifically about climate change. And I basically took this theory that was written for a theory journal and wrote it for Nature Climate Action, which is more of a general journal around climate change. And there I basically took COVID as an example for showing how much things changed. And it was just great because right when it happened, I remember Greta Thunberg, if you remember her,
Oh, of course.
yeah,
Yes.
she posted this thing, and maybe it was a letter in The Guardian, but it was basically like, "COVID shows when there is enough of a sense of risk, the world changes." And I'm like, "Exactly, Greta, exactly."
And she's only
S
what, 18 or
well,
20?
at the time, she was, yeah, maybe 19, yeah, so
Yeah.
but she had felt very wise, but she had in the process of that, so she basically followed the science. She had all of the folks that she was working with from Fridays for Future stop doing stuff out in the world and encouraged everybody to go and support the lockdown. And it basically killed her movement. I mean, it really did kill the climate momentum that we had at
Yeah.
that time ended there. But so, as COVID wore on and all of this, and the world changed and the climate crisis, like we had this moment where everybody's like, look, unintended side effect. CO2 emissions have gone down and people's transportation have gone down, consumption has gone down, and then blam, we're on the other side and everybody's socially mixing and
Yeah. Back
CO2,
to normal.
emissions are skyrocketing, rocketing. And basically out of that, I was like, yeah, we're gonna have to things are gonna have to get bad. And basically the experience of how bad it was for COVID and that we didn't sustain and address the problems that were causing it led me to realize how bad it really has to get the kinds of changes we're talking about. Because addressing climate change is no joke, right? It's not like
Yeah.
you can just like pop out one battery and put a different battery into, your flashlight and you're done. It's basically about taking this huge industrial system and shifting it substantially. I mean, and you know, as much as I was critical of the Inflation Reduction Act and of the way that that policy came about during the Biden administration, in a lot of ways, that policy started investing enough money to start to make it possible to shift this like huge cargo ship of some sort, right? So that we could start to move. And there's already that people are talking about the momentum and how there's been a transition to clean energy, to electric vehicles, opening up opportunities for it. And that's all being shut down. And that is the answer shift. We're shifting back now,
Hmm.
the multi-directionality there. And we're seeing the state really repressing that kind of innovation, which is why we cannot count on the market to do it for us. And that is, that's why I'm an apocalyptic optimist. And that's why the main way that I see that it's most likely we can get to the other side of the climate crisis is through a mass mobilization of civil society because states and markets are basically captured by fossil fuel interests. Certainly in the United States and in most of the world, actually. There are very few states that aren't like that. Sad but true.
Yeah, that is sad but true. And for a long time, I think I was in that camp of, hey, there's going to be, like you said in the very beginning, the politicians can stop talking about climate change and shut down this, but business realizes it, and business is going to be the one that saves us. Or I was more focused on the insurance companies saving us for a while. Like,
Well, I think the insurance companies actually are what some people would call can be like compatriots in the struggle, but I don't think that they'll do it themselves because there are just so many other industries that are so connected to fossil fuels, and
yeah,
fossil fuel interests have so much power if you just look at their power in terms of how they've invested in political power through not just Republicans, but also Democrats, not just at the federal level, but also at the state level, at the local level. It's everywhere, and
yeah,
until those, greasy fossil fuel covered hands are not all over decision making, there's gonna be a lot of folks who are much more interested in making money
yeah,
than they are in, saving us. I mean, and it used to be, I'd say, getting the planet, but it's just not just about saving the planet. It's about saving frontline communities and protecting communities of color and saving poor people and addressing, income inequalities and resource inequalities. But,
well,
that is not
those,
where we are today.
no, it's, there's a couple words that come to mind when you describe all this, and that's overwhelming and maybe some hopelessness. And so I'm wondering, as the apocalyptic optimist, how do you suggest people listening or just anyone going about climate action to feel like they've made changes, but not get caught up in like, oh my God, this is so, it's too late. What could I do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's first of all, I would just say that it's important to recognize that we all are gonna have our moments of hopelessness, right?
Hmm.
Eco anxiety, climate anxiety, fear, despair. And in this political context, I mean, the political moment we're living through right now, that's just gonna be amplified.
It
So
is.
yeah, and I think that, I mean, the first thing I would just say, and this is the part about being realistic about where we are, is we all need to sit with it. And sometimes we need to be really like just down with it. But one of the things that research tells us is that when we get angry, we start to have this sense of efficacy. And
Mhm.
so, I mean, the two things I would just say is one is embrace your anger. We so
Okay.
frequently, I mean, particularly women are told, like, don't be angry. You don't want to be shrill. You know what? I think this is a perfectly wonderful time to be shrill. You want to
Yeah.
be shrill, embrace your shrill. Should make a t-shirt. But I
Brace your
mean, so
shrill.
embrace your shrill. I mean, I am shrill and I'm proud. I mean, basically,
There we
there
go.
are lots of reasons to be mad.
Mhm.
And I think that anger it's a legit emotion right now, and I think everybody is, should be angry, but also when you're angry, you start to think about what you can do to stop the problem. And it is a huge problem. It is extremely daunting. We're dealing with a poly crisis right now, not just a climate crisis, we're dealing with a crisis to democracy in our country. I
Yes.
mean, and it's not just in our country, although I have to say that it's heartening in some ways to see all these countries who are like, "Oh, we're fighting, but we're pushing back against Trumpism because we see what a mess it is in the United
Yeah.
States." And it's heartening that that is happening because I'm happy that other countries are not going through what we're gonna go through, but what we're going through or whatever. But oof, I mean, there is a lot of this kind of right wing populism and
Like
autocracy.
India is a good example,
Yeah.
Turkey.
Oh, for sure, yeah. So, anyway, so we're living through this, and there's lots to be hopeless about, but I think that it's important to, like, sit with your emotions and then find the anger. And one of
Mm.
the things that I say to a lot of people is like, instead of thinking about changing the world, think about changing your community and changing where you live.
Yeah,
Because it's a
more
lot,
local.
yeah, it's a lot easier to make social change at the local level. It takes less work. You don't need as much power, but you also can find your power there in your local community. And I used to tell the story about our electric school buses here in my community. And it happens to be there's a bus stop right outside the window right here. So I always,
Maybe you'll see one.
I frequently see and it comes and you cannot hear them because they're electric. I mean, yeah, but the thing that's so great about it is there was a whole push in the community to get electric school buses because you don't have diesel fumes, it's better for particulate matter, it
Oh,
reduces asthma rates for everybody. I'm asthmatic, my daughter's asthmatic, so that's good, and oh, and it doesn't burn fossil fuels. So, these are all good things, and that process of that transition was hard won, but it was a lot easier and more doable because it was here in our community.
mm,
And when you work on projects in your community, not only is it more likely to be successful, but you also then have these connections with people in your community that can help to build, support for those times when you feel climate anxiety or hopelessness. And what you just want to hope is that everybody, I mean, it's very unlikely that everybody will feel hopeless at the same time. It can happen, but that's why you want a big social network because in your
you do.
social network, then you'll find people, sometimes you're down and other times other people are down. I mean, that's just kind of the way the world works. So I don't think people should be like, I can't be down and I can't recognize how hard this is because that's just that's just like a recipe for burnout. What we really need to do is be honest with our emotions, but we also need to embrace our anger because there's a lot of reasons to be angry right now, but there are also a lot of ways to think about solving the problem, at least at the local level. And what we know from politics, I mean, our democratic system was designed to start at the local level and go up these different on ramps and the highways to the federal level, right?
Yeah.
Is the way it was described. And the thing is we've been kind of bypassing that whole infrastructure, the federalism infrastructure, and just people have been trying to like make change nationally and skip out on the local. And I
Yes.
think that
I see that too much.
yeah, and I think that's a place where we should be really spending our time and investing in it. And there are a number of reasons for that.
Yeah, in the world of design where I'm coming from, it was similar in maybe a strategic approach that we learned at some point. What you just said, that a lot of designers, well, I want to do this big thing and make this big wave of impact or whatever they want to do, and we've learned it's better just to be very local about it. These sort of small bets can lead to bigger ones, but you have to start small and you have to start local.
Yeah.
So
I
that's
mean,
good
and
to
I
hear.
think that same message works for politics too, right?
No, I agree 100%. And I think we joked when we first met that, it was going to be impossible to not talk about politics in our in our conversation. And I see like the Democratic Party is one like historically that hasn't focused on local politics, and it's definitely come back to haunt them. And now
Oh, for
they've
sure.
got the message, and they're I hope they're trying harder, but that remains to be
Well,
seen.
yeah, well, I mean, I would just say so I've written 3 books, not saving ourselves, but 3 books about why the left keeps losing. The
Hmm.
first one was written in 2006, and the message there the book was called Activism Inc., and the message there is exactly the same message as now, which is that basically the Democratic Party and left political leaders tend to rely on shortcuts and instrumental politics rather than building real grassroots.
Hmm.
And, if you think about the most recent election where there were all these shortcuts of getting people from blue states to call in to strangers or go knock on strangers' doors in purple areas or red
Yeah,
areas with blue dots,
I
right?
got those messages. Yeah.
Right? That is not how you change the world. You don't change the
Hmm.
world by, parachuting in and trying to tell strangers what to do. The
Yeah.
way you change the world is you get to know your neighbors and you get to know people in your communities and you work together to make real social change and you commit because you're here, like you
Hmm.
live there. You live the change. And
Yeah.
that's something that unfortunately we've seen and I even wrote about this in 2006 like the Republican Party was investing in that way back then. And you could see the way that, the Trump administration, the Trump campaign took advantage of that kind of investment and that building of local ties in communities across the country. And it worked out.
Yeah, I just saw a quick interview with Naomi Klein, and she was talking about how the Republicans, but particularly Trump, did like the unthinkable of been able to connect the very poor and the billionaires together as this community through what you just described. And I guess it was like not something when it was happening, like the election, I couldn't see it. And it
Oh,
wasn't
I mean,
until
so
after.
I just remember NPR actually was reported on Trump's efforts in like poor Latino communities. And I
Mm,
remember being, well, apoplectic when I heard the story. I was like, "Oh my gosh, they're selling people this like promise of, well, the promise that they're not going to get deported and the promise that they're going to address income inequality in our country, neither of which are true." And now it's interesting because I remember there was a follow-up story with, I think it was the Venezuelan community, and there were numerous people who were like, "He promised us that we would be safe."
just straight up
So,
lies, right?
yes, yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because right now I don't think that they can sustain this because there was such misinformation, right?
Yeah.
So many ways that people were lied to. And so they're gonna I mean, but then if you get rid of all the democratic system, you don't really need to lie to people anymore because you win, right? So that's why we all need to get angry and we all need to fight back against autocracy at the same time that we figure out how to save our communities because climate shocks are coming. And one of the things I always tell my students is, when the climate shock comes, when you get hit with a hurricane, an extreme weather event, a wildfire, even an extreme heat wave, in a lot of those cases, one of the first thing that happens is you lose electricity. And you
Yes.
certainly will lose, cell phone service in many of these. So if your entire social network is, on TikTok, on social media, and you're going to count on those people to save you when disaster strikes, think again. You're going to be
Yeah.
trapped with whoever is around you.
Get to
So
know your
that is one of the
neighbors.
reasons you get to know your neighbors, and that is why resilience is so important.
Yeah. I mean, I remember big storm came through here. There's a word for it. It starts with a D. It's like a
Was it a
hurricane.
derecho?
Yes. It
We
came
got hit
through.
with a derecho, and it the neighbor's Prius was murdered by the derecho by a tree, and then a huge tree fell on my house.
Oh
This
God.
was a
Yeah.
number of years ago. That's why I'll never forget the word derecho because I was like, "What is this
Mhm.
derecho thing?" It's like, "Oh, it's the thing that killed my roof." And but we didn't realize how bad it was until my daughter came out of her bedroom and said that her walls were crying. She was
Oh
little.
my God.
I know because it was because of rain and it came, because the roof had been like knocked over, but we were like, "We're not gonna deal with this tonight. We're just gonna, stay in the basement." And then she went in and she's like, "My walls are crying." So
Did your neighbors come to help? Because that's what happened to me, which was really great. Like the tree came down and two people came over and were helping me, and it was really nice. And I mean, I barely knew them. I mean, we said hi and nice guy, but I'm glad that I have good neighbors.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think well, let's see, that time we did well, that when the derecho hit, our neighborhood was apparently ground zero for the derecho in the DC area. It
Oh,
took
good
us
lord, 10 days
to get electricity back, so we had to go to live with my sister.
Mm.
So the neighbors weren't able really to help. I mean, we
Oh,
helped one
got it.
another, but everybody was like, "Get me, how do you get out of here?" Because
Yeah,
it was
everyone left.
summer. But when we had another time, we had a tree fall down, and I had all these neighbors come, and I had this sociologist I knew came with his, chainsaw 'cause I knew somebody I didn't know, I knew somebody who had a chainsaw, and he came with a chainsaw and helped us cut it up, and then my neighbors came and we're all like they were like, "Oh, we'll take some wood," because we were like, "What do we do with all this wood?" And they were
Yeah.
rolling it up the street, so people just came. It was very nice, and my daughter made, like, popovers, it
Yeah,
was
that
nice.
just happened similarly in, like, Spain and Portugal where the power went out, and I saw these videos of everyone just sort of coming together outside and talking to one another, and
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing that we know. We know first of all, we know climate shocks are gonna hit more, which are these climate change exacerbated extreme events of all sorts. But we also know that the natural response tends to be bond, not to
yes.
isolate, but to bond with people in your communities. I mean, I lived in New York City when 9/11 happened. I had just moved there and it was
Oh, wow.
horrible and beautiful all at the same time.
Yeah, I
But the
bet.
way that the community came together, but that we know, and we also know from research that when people experience climate shocks, the experience reverberates and mobilizes and motivates. And there's been a number of studies recently that tell us about how when communities are hit with climate shocks, no matter your political ideology, you become much more supportive of climate science and much more supportive of climate action. And in some cases, my work has documented how people get actually more engaged and become more involved in activism.
Well, let's talk about your book because I see it right there in your shelf. Saving ourselves from climate shocks. There's that word, that phrase again, to climate action. And I'm curious, I have a sinking feeling about this, but I want to ask it anyways. What inspired you to write that book and what did you hope would happen from its publishing?
That's a good question. Okay, so the original reason I wrote this book is that I was asked to be a contributing author on the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change's
Oh, that's
most
awesome.
recent assessment reports, right? So yeah, I got nominated by people in a chapter in the mitigation working group. So that's working group 3 with mitigation, right? And I got invited to be involved in a chapter on policy instruments, and I was asked to come in to contribute a sections, and this was the first time I had been asked to do this on climate or civic engagement in climate activism. So looking at the ways that people getting involved had an effect on climate. And so I started out for the thing, and this was during COVID. And so I wrote, I was like, well, this is so exciting. So I did my work, in like my bunker in my house during the pandemic. And they were just like, write as much as you can. So I wrote this big review of everything we knew, and it was like 12 pages long. Well, my section ended up being 3 paragraphs. I mean, I am lucky to have gotten 3 paragraphs into the report, and I did
Oh,
get
yeah.
1 sentence in the summary for policymakers that had become so blanded out because we couldn't say fossil fuel interests, and it basically said something like, "In some cases, citizen activism and engagement can address some components of the climate crisis." That was the sentence that I got in, and everybody's like,
Watered
"Look, you gotta
down.
s."
Yeah.
I know, well, because, that goes through this governmental review
Yes.
and, you know, those folks who come from fossil fuel states or petro states didn't want there to be any reference to fossil fuel interests. So and they didn't wanna say too much about the good things that activism can do. So I basically wrote that. It was, an exciting experience, but I felt like there was a lot more to say, and so I was asked to write this paper, and so I basically took that and made it like into my section, my first 12 pages, and made it into an article,
That's
which was
great.
called Climate Activism and Its Effects, which got published at Wire's Climate Change right around the same time that the IPCC report finally came out. And, and that was a lot about what the capacity for climate activism, but also what it didn't go into, like, why we need climate activism because that was not really the focus of the paper, and it didn't only tell a story about what's needed next, right? Because we know that activism can do things, but it's not necessarily doing it.
Mm.
And so, I actually I worked with Columbia University Press for many years. I wrote my last book with them. I edited a series with them, and so I went to my editor there at the time, and I said to him, "I really think I wanna write this book, and I want it to be for the general public about, how we got here and where we need to go." And so that's how Saving Ourselves was born. So the idea was instead of doing new research, I mean, I did bring in new data in some ways, but the idea was really to package the message that I have had in many papers for a more general audience so people understand how we got here, the reality of how bad it is, and then the reality that there are ways we can save ourselves, but it's going to, it involves us doing something. We can't just sit on the couch drinking Chardonnay and watching Netflix and think that the world's gonna change because it's
Yeah.
not. You also can't, as I told my students, you can't go on TikTok and do it either, although I feel like people seem to be a little less, excited about TikTok these days than they were.
Yeah, yeah, after the whole, like, being shut down for
Yeah,
some
yeah,
period
and the
of time.
failure of their efforts to, like, mobilize through for the Willow Project, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think from what I'm hearing from you, and also something I gleaned from a conversation I had with a guest this season, Jenny Morgan. She has this book on cancel culture and climate, and that you're going to need in this future of climate shocks your neighbor who voted for Trump as much as they're going to need you in this. So we have a lot more in common, of course. We all know that than what the politicians typically say. It's just really important that these conversations somehow get less polarized.
Yeah,
But
I completely agree. I mean, I actually I was, we were very lucky to host Catherine Hayhoe to give an endowed lecture
Oh
at
my
American
gosh, yeah, she's
University
wonderful.
yeah,
Yeah.
this year, this spring. And so she actually invited me to do a conversation because her book is called Saving Us and mine is Saving Ourselves.
Yeah, I saw that on LinkedIn. That was
Yeah,
amazing.
and so she invited me because I was gonna moderate her, her lecture and just kinda introduce her, and she's like, "Let's do a conversation about our books and how they're similar and different." And I actually think that I didn't realize that I actually didn't know about her book when I started working on my book because her book is really very much for the general public, and
Mhm.
mine really builds off of a lot of the social science I've done. And then when they came out, I ended up reading them and I was like, "Wow, there's a lot to say here." I mean, in a lot of ways, what her book is about is how to have these conversations, and it's not really about we don't focus on what makes us different, but rather we focus on what makes us similar.
Yeah.
And there's always a way to find, that nugget where we can start the conversation. And, I mean, more and more now, it's just like this question is, do we even, I mean, and I'm not apologizing for doing work on climate. I've done climate work my entire career.
Mm.
But like, if we don't use the word climate change, I'm fine with it. If you want to say resilience, you want to say disaster response and recovery, I don't
Right.
mind that. I mean, the thing I think is really interesting is the research tells us that you won't have to say the word climate for people to recognize that when extreme events happen that are exacerbated by climate change, they know that that needs to stop. And it doesn't matter their political ideology. After you experience that, you start to think about it. I mean, and the one caveat I'll say is that we've seen in California after the wildfires, we also saw in North Carolina after the hurricanes last fall, that areas that where people, were not understanding everything that was going on opened up these opportunities for misinformation
Yeah,
that led to,
totally.
led to people like blaming, water policy on the wildfires
Right.
or people saying that, President Biden had created the hurricanes and that FEMA was there to monitor people rather than to give people money and support them and help
Oh,
them clean out.
bizarre.
Yeah, I mean,
It's just so
it's bizarre
bizarre.
and it's really depressing because now a lot of people lost out on opportunities to have federal support for, recovery. I mean, and from what I hear, I was talking to somebody who was just down in Asheville recently who said it's still a disaster site and there's still so much work to be done. And
Yeah, and
it's
there's no
too bad
FEMA
that
coming. There's no FEMA coming for that.
there is not yet at this point. FEMA's not coming. The FEMA Corps that AmeriCorps coordinates, that's not gonna be coming.
Gone.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the common ground thing I think is I don't think it's I mean, sometimes it can be hard to do. I find it easier. Maybe it's just my approach to it, but I have a friend that I used to work with who's more conservative than I am, more religious than I am. He went to Ohio State, I went to Michigan. So there's a lot of differences between us, but we both come back to this like feeling of why can't we just be kind to each other? Why can't we just have a conversation with each other? Why does it have to be so divided? And we've grown closer as friends over the years. And he ended up voting for Harris in Ohio, which was an amazing thing to hear from him that he did based on our past. But I think there's that what is that the apocalyptic optimism in that conversation there. And you recently here's my question to you though. You really put an interesting quote out from your book on LinkedIn that drew my attention. And it was, how much suffering will we need to endure before a critical mass of people rises to push actively and aggressively for social change? And when I read that, I didn't know the answer. So I'm wondering, what's your answer to that? And I was also curious about what's your answer now during the new Trump administration to maybe when you wrote the book?
Well, so when the book came out, I did a bunch of interviews where at some point everybody would say, "Okay, so what's gonna happen to the election?" And and I was like, "Well, I don't have my crystal ball with me, but I can tell you this." I said this. I said if Trump wins, in some ways, it will actually be better for climate change than if he loses. Now,
Mm,
I wanna add the caveats here, which is
hmm.
there are lots of terrible things that are happening
Yes.
during this administration, and there are many people who are losing jobs, losing healthcare, losing coverage, losing support, uh, losing family members to being deported. I mean, there are lots of horrible things happening, and I'm not saying any of those things are good. But I am saying this. if we had a Harris administration right now, given the policies that she campaigned on, we would be continuing business as usual.
Yep.
Business as usual, where we had the largest climate policy ever passed in the United States, and it was through the Congress, which, as somebody who studied all of these failed congressional bills, was exciting.
Yeah, it was
It le
amazing.
it was amazing, but it also led the United States to become the number 1 oil and natural gas exporter and producer in the world. So we
It's
became like
wild.
and yeah, it empowered the fossil fuel industry.
Mm.
And while early on there was a discussion about Harris might push back against fracking, push back more aggressive around climate, she did not. And so if she were in power right now, we would be continuing to limp along and do something incremental which would not get us where we need to go. And instead, we knew that because Project 2025 wrote it all out, right? There were no secrets there. It was all about drill baby drill, extract baby extract, open up public lands. And I was like, oh, that's not going to happen. Well, guess what happened this week, folks? It's happening. It's happening everywhere. The beauty of it is that it takes a really long time to go from opening up public lands to actually drilling, extracting, and burning. So there's still time.
Like
But
years,
what
right?
it takes years, but at the same time, it also once companies invest a certain amount of money, there's this whole stranded asset component to it. So what we really wanna hope is that the judicial system slows that process down, but things are gonna get bad a lot faster now. And so and one of the things that I've written about in other work and I talk about in Saving Ourselves is that the climate movement, you know, has been around for a while, but it does not do a great job of connecting across identity, orientation, and social class, and it needs to. And a lot of the work,
Yes.
from the research I've done on social movements that have the most effect and are the most successful are those that build this solidarity. And so one of the things I've been talking about for many years is how does the climate movement do it? And it was very hard to do during the Harris administration. Or sorry, during the Biden administration. It would have been hard during the Harris administration because there's some climate groups that were like, well, we're getting some of what we need, maybe incremental policies, blah, 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 blah. And then the other side was like, no, and they would fight and they would protest one another and they would argue and there was like
Yeah.
nasty words exchange. I mean, there's all of that, right?
Mhm.
Well, those days are over. There is this huge need across the left for a unified front to push back against Trumpism and push
Pe
back against autocracy and push back against Doge. And we are seeing the left unify.
Oh,
And
I was
when they
wondering, do you see it happening?
we see it happening. I mean, there's still some challenges. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest challenges, the way our universities are treating students and student activism on campus is a real problem.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw what happened at Columbia yesterday. We had a
Um,
protest.
no, I
Oh,
did not.
so yes, so last night, students against the war in Gaza occupied part of Butler Library at Columbia. And Columbia administration once again called in New York City police to come in riot gear to arrest everybody and remove them
Not
forcibly.
again, jeez.
Yeah, again, you'd think they'd learn. I mean, which is very, very different from the way that the government responded and administrations responded to activism on campuses back during the 60s, right?
Right.
I mean, and that makes a difference. And it's interesting because so that happened yesterday. And I know a number of groups on campuses are organizing stuff during these weeks around
I saw
graduation.
that, yeah.
So it's likely to get spicy. Let's say that.
Mm.
But one of the things that's interesting is that the student, I mean, I know from studying students, working with students, students were not feeling supported. They're not feeling included in, the resistance or whatever you want to call it right now.
Yeah.
And yet, I was just at this 2-day event where people were talking about civil society 100 days in, how are we gonna fight back against Trumpism? And all of these, let's just call them older, whiter, privileged folks from different think tanks were like, "Oh, don't worry, the students are gonna push back. The students are
Seriously.
gonna." No, seriously, and it's
Uh-huh.
funny because I was in the audience. Well, one of them I actually spoke up, but one of them was a roundtable, one of them I was in the audience, and I was like, "Wait a minute." But they didn't call me, but I wanted to be like, "What makes you think the students are gonna help you now? Look at what's going on campuses."
You're
I mean,
arresting
we have
them.
the same thing happening on our campus right now where a student unfurled a Palestinian flag at the, inaugural ceremony for our new president, peacefully, quietly in the back of a room. She was manhandled out of there. She's being held and, prosecuted. And they're using terms like terrorism for
Yeah.
this woman who unfurled peacefully, didn't say anything. She just held up a flag. And if you can't do that on campuses, Well, first of all, you can't pick and choose. Either people have rights or they don't have rights. And if you get people, if you don't give people rights, what makes you think that they're going to start to stand up? And I mean, I can tell you what happens historically is that everything gets much more aggressive and much more violent and much more quicker because people don't
Mhm.
tend to give up because of repression. They just push back harder. But what we're seeing, right now across the left is we're seeing, particularly among older people, I mean, like middle age, people like
Like
me
me.
and older,
Yeah.
like us, right? We're all coming together and, you may come because you want, worried about, the federal government being destroyed or the Department of Education being destroyed. And I may come because of USAID, or I may come, but many people have what we call an intersectionality of interests around many different themes, including climate. And climate tends to be one of the top ones.
Oh,
So
that's really
climate
interesting.
is embedded in these motivations. The thing that's missing right now is young people and college kids. And it's a real problem, and that's the one message I don't know how that's gonna be resolved. There's a big day of action called the No Kings Day of Action that's been announced for
That's
June
coming up.
14th. Yeah,
Yeah.
June 14th, but it's actually like this will be the longest, uh, preparation time that we've seen since the Trump administration took office because it's still, a month and a week from now? And it already has this huge list, this coalition that's broadening. It runs across those who are issue-based groups as well as like general political groups, like Indivisible is one of the leads on it.
Yes.
And it looks like it's going to be huge. Now, what I would love to see is I'd love to see groups that represent communities of color and young people both getting involved. And I'm not sure if we will yet, but that's what's needed. And when we see that, that's when we can imagine and envision the kind of mass mobilization that's necessary. So it was a really long answer to your question.
No, it's a great answer because you brought up something I was gonna ask you, and that was how the climate activism movement doesn't effectively connect people across all the different identities and orientations and social classes. And I was hearing bits and pieces of it in that answer you called long, but I'm like, how do they do a better job? Because this is something as I've been thinking about a lot too, and I don't know if I have a really good answer to it.
Well, I can tell you this. I mean, so we shouldn't when we think about this, we should recognize that this has been documented across the advanced industrialized world, right? So it's not just the United States where the climate movement tends to be really privileged, really educated, really white, really middle aged, right? Now, there was this moment after Greta started skipping school where we had a lot of young people filling in, and there was a lot more young people involved. I actually did a study of them, and I worked with Fridays for Future, then I did a longer term study here in the United States. And what we found was that while the folks who were participating in the school strike movement were more racially and ethnically diverse, they still came from families where their parents were highly educated. So they're still very privileged. So that's still a problem, right? One of the things that I think is heartening right now is that with all the layoffs and all of the implications of tariffs, which I was just
Yeah.
talking to somebody yesterday, I don't even remember who it was, and they were like, we're going to see, shelves empty in the next month. With all of that, what we're going to see is this obvious opportunity to connect with labor in ways that we haven't before. I mean, I saw at the Hands Off rally here in DC because I'm out serving protesters now with my team because it's one of the things that we do. And we see unions coming in, like in historically, like back during the first resistance, right? So during Trump one, we would see unions come out and everybody like was in their own place, and the union folks would pass out their stuff and
Yeah.
buttons and whatever. And Indivisible and the other groups, Move On, would be there doing their own thing. Now, when the unions come marching through and they show up, they get cheered.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so there's definitely an opening up and an engagement and a recognition of inclusiveness, which is the start. So, I mean, I just would say that that's what it is
It's
it's all
beginning.
about feeling solidarity. And I think that in some ways, all of these people who come from kind of more of the professional world losing their jobs the way they are, but who many of whom are in unions like the Federal Service Union, et cetera, is starting to help people recognize how labor works across social class. And I think that's probably very helpful.
Yeah, I have a kind of follow-up to that, and it's from someone I had on the season last season, Kobe Nasik, who works a lot out in California in climate activism work. And he's the type of person that's out there at the protests, in the streets, marching. And I asked him because myself and other people included, maybe even more so now during the Trump administration, have a sense of fear about being out there. And so he had a beautiful answer to my question about how can you still be involved without being there? And I'm curious, uh, I can share with you what he said, but I really want to hear what your thoughts are about that.
Well, so I mean, so that's a great question. I frequently get asked the question that's like, well, what if I don't want to march in the streets? Or is
Yeah.
marching in the streets really going to make a difference? I mean, and I have answers to those as well. But I mean, what I would say, first of all, we're in an all hands on deck moment, right? With the climate crisis, with the crisis to our democracy. So it's going to take everybody doing anything they're comfortable doing. But we don't all have to get arrested and we don't all have to be marching in the
I
streets and
hope
yelling
not.
with
No, yeah.
signs. I mean, and some people may feel more at risk. I mean, people who have identities that feel like they're attacked, people
Many
who are
people.
worried about being deported, people who are worried for whatever reason. Right? I mean, I had a lot of students who are really worried about not being
Yeah,
allowed back
me
in the
too.
country.
Me
I
too.
mean, I also wonder how long it's gonna be before, that people like you and me are gonna have a hard time getting back in the country.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, so a lot of people there's a good reason to be afraid. Nobody should be, like, feeling bad about that. And what people need to do is figure out what they're comfortable doing. And then that goes back to this, the last point in the book, which we were talking about before, about cultivating resilience. There's so much work we can do in our communities that's about building resilience. And when I say resilience, it's resilience to climate shocks. What can you do so that when the next derecho comes, it doesn't destroy your house? I mean, you could cut down all your we could cut down all the trees, but I'm not saying we cut down all the trees,
Yeah.
but there are lots of things you could do so people's houses are less likely to get flooded. And there's all the social resilience in terms of helping to support people when there are losses, to create mutual aid opportunities. I was out in California a couple months ago, right after the wildfires, and was lucky to go through Altadena and see the effects of the
Mm,
wildfires. It was
it's terrible.
devastating, and I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it was really, I had no idea that a wildfire will actually burn the tires off of a car
Wow.
because it's that hot. I mean, because I've seen you see fires like on the highway or whatever.
Yeah.
This is not like that. This is like the car is just like a shell. But in that experience, like one of the things that was great to see is that there were people who were like coordinating around the different like streets. So people were trying to figure out
Mm,
and support one another who needed places to go and
yeah.
resources and how to figure out. I mean, unfortunately, I've heard there's been a lot of problems with getting insurance companies to pay out. So there's that. But I know that there's a lot more support there. And that's the kind of thing we can all do. You do not have to,
Yeah.
you know, hold up a sign and go yell on a Saturday. You can do that in your community. You can do that when you have the time.
Yeah, your answer is pretty similar. I like the way that Kobe phrased it in that you don't have to be on the street, doing this, but you could be that person that shows up when another person does get arrested with food and water, as they come out of the
Yeah,
hold
yeah,
up,
yeah.
the cell and or, you're there with a blanket. You're giving money to that organization that is helping these folks, and that sounds more like me. So I was happy to hear that, and yeah, and that you kinda said the same thing too. So
Yeah, I mean, but, the only thing I would just add to that is that while, yes, money can help and money if you have the money and your resources and you can, that's very important, but I think it's really important in this moment to recognize that we need to try to do more than just give money. We need to give
mm,
time and make those connections because those connections are so important.
yeah, I even saw, I forget who it was, but they were kind of yelling on the internet to the Democratic Party, like, "Stop asking for money and start cultivating real change,"
Yeah.
because I just get so many messages still, like, "Can you donate? Can you donate?"
Yeah, no,
Mm.
I remember the week after the election getting a message from forget who it was, somebody in the party, and I was like, "Are you kidding me right now asking me for money?
I know,
This is
yeah.
not the time for you to ask me to give you a cent." You know?
Well, you said resilience, and I know from probably both of our experiences in academia and life, you have to be resilient, and it's harder for some. So What does that word resilient mean to you in relation to the climate movement?
Well, in terms of thinking about climate change, I think about resilience as being about making our communities and, our lives more capable of withstanding whatever comes, be it
Yeah.
social or environmental shocks. And those shocks could be a climate shock, right? A heat wave, a wildfire, a derecho, or it could
Yeah.
be a shock like, half of my community, half of my neighborhood losing jobs because they work for the federal government. Because, I live in
Mm.
DC. So,
My neighbor, in fact, lost his
yeah.
job.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and so both of those things, resilience is about being able to withstand those kinds of shocks. And so building it is about trying to figure out how to support one another so that, as the wind blows, we bend and then we straighten back up.
Hmm. Yeah. There's, I think, some little practical things too about my dad always told me, like, you need to have 6 months of cash, in your bank. And I'm like, how do I do that, dad? And he's like, well, you got to get a job. And then every month put 10% of your savings into that account. And so, or my
I
paycheck.
don't know. It's funny. I mean, I know people who are starting to talk about building bunkers again. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I
Mhm.
don't know if they have to give me. I know like you need to be able to handle it if you lose your job. How much money do you need to have for that?
Yeah.
But I mean, there's
Bunkers.
also the whole like, well, if you remember during COVID, everybody's like, how much food do we need in the basement?
Yeah. Yeah.
How much toilet paper do you need?
Oh, yeah.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, that.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know if I would put that part in resilience. Although honestly, like I have, when we lived it back in New Jersey, we got hit with a big flood and lost access to our house. And
Mm.
FEMA and Red Cross came through and gave us money and helped us out and gave us like brushes and like spray and gloves so we didn't get nasty on ourselves.
Yeah. That's
And
good.
but being resilient then, like, I don't know that I mean, obviously having money in the bank so that we could go to a hotel was super valuable, or knowing people where we could stay, like, we were able to go stay at my dad's house for a while, but I just think the key to resilience, in my opinion, is making sure we're not just thinking about the environment there, and we're thinking about our social system.
Yeah.
And I think that in this moment, that's particularly important because I think a lot of people get stuck in thinking about, oh, how do we make it so the basement doesn't flood anymore? Or how do we make it so the sump pump works? Or, like, and that's important.
Yeah.
But there's also the part where we need to have one another to lean on when we need to.
100%. We're coming up here to my last question, and it's one that I think you mentioned in one of the emails to me that you do a lot of work with, and you talked about it in this interview. And I really want to know because you're feeling some of the younger generation is not getting involved as much as they could. What's your advice to encourage younger people to become more engaged in the climate movement?
Well, I mean, I think that younger people need to I think a lot of young people are engaged, but I think a lot of young people have given up on our democratic system.
Mm.
And what I would like to encourage them to do is think about the world that they want to live in and then try to manifest that world and think about how they can build structures and
Yeah.
support structures to make it possible on their college campuses, in their cities, in their communities. And it's going to involve, I mean, certainly, I mean, young people care so much about climate change. So it's about that. It's about living and practicing our climate beliefs, right? And it's young people are very aware of this. They're very concerned. They're very knowledgeable about what needs to be done around climate change. But I think they also are very frustrated with this idea that they seem to have been treated by particularly by the left in the past couple of years as these instrumental cogs that can be used to try to get other young people to turn out without anybody listening to what they think, anybody
Hmm.
letting them have their voices and their opinions and, you know, listening to what they want to see happen. And I know a lot of that is about thinking about systemic changes that connect across environmental justice, racial justice, economic justice, and, bring those themes together. And I know a lot of climate groups have gone through periods of time where they're like, yeah, 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 just help us now, and then we'll work it out. I mean, and that's not worked out so well for everybody.
Yeah.
So I think there's gonna I mean, I just hope we don't have to see a reckoning here before young people join again because we don't have a lot of time.
Hmm.
And things are getting worse a lot faster now than they were before.
Hmm.
Again, we may not see record of them until they hit us because that is by design, that there's not gonna
Yeah.
be as much data and information. I mean, and I'm very happy I don't live in a hurricane-prone area because apparently
Yeah.
we don't need
Noah's
those
not.
warnings.
Yeah,
Mm.
Noah's not really monitoring a lot as much as they used to.
Well, yeah, as of today, those data sets are no longer being refreshed, and the sea ice monitoring is no longer being refreshed. I mean, all that stuff that American science has supported.
Hmm.
It's a real problem. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to end on that note, but I'm curious in terms of what is keeping you motivated during this time, this darkest timeline, this onion article that we're living in.
Well, I like that. I mean, I think so. So I lean into the sarcasm a lot, but I mean, I also so I I mean, sometimes sometimes it's just like either we laugh or we cry. So
Mhm.
I go for the laughing as much as I can. These are dark days. One of the things that I've been spending a lot of time focusing on is my kids, right? I mean, and this
Mhm.
is the smallest unit of analysis in terms of community. Smallest unit of community is family, and
Yeah.
I'm spending a lot of time with my kids, trying to make sure that they feel loved and they know
It's
how
great.
they can, and trying to help make them the kind of people we need to make the world a better place. Spending time with family wherever I can and frequently feeling bad that I'm not doing more in my community. So,
Mm.
but I mean, I think that and I'm writing a lot. I'm trying to work on another book. But when the dark comes, I mean, I also do sometimes sit with it and just be like, wow,
Mhm.
it's bad. And sometimes, I mean, I go out to the big protests. I mean, I collect data there, so I study them. But sometimes there's nothing more inspiring than being around a bunch of other people who are willing to take the
Yeah.
time off to yell and scream into the void and raise their voices as one, because that's one of the whole points of these days of action. Because you're not going to change the world in that day, and nobody thinks you are. But going out there with a bunch of other people who also feel like the world needs to change can be really inspiring and motivating. And
Strengthen the
yeah,
community.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dana, for being on the show. Before we go, where can everyone find you online, and what's the name of your new book, and where can we get it?
All right, so you can find me online at www.danarfisher.com, and from there you can get to my TED Talk, which is making a case for apocalyptic optimism, which is about my most recent book, which is called Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action. And I can share with you a discount code for people to get 20% off if they want.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
All right. Well,
Well,
thank you so much.
yes,
It was
thank
great
you.
chatting.
Thanks for listening. We want to hear from you. What did you take away from this discussion? Email us at climifypodcast@gmail.com or connect with us on Instagram at climifypodcast. We would love to read your inspirational stories on the show in upcoming episodes. This program is produced by Jackie Himmel and Adam Java. A big shout out to our new designer this season, Tyler Mayfield, and our social media strategist, Brianna Reggioni. Sound engineering and editing by me, Eric Benson. A special thanks to Mark O'Brien at The Climate Designers. You can find design prompts and more information on all of our guests this season at climatedesigners.org/edu/Climify and on Instagram and LinkedIn at Climify Podcast. If you enjoy the work we all do here and you have a spare minute or two, we would truly appreciate it if you left a rating and review over at Apple Podcasts. The more folks reviewing our program, the higher the algorithm pushes us up in the search results. And in turn, the more likely we all could learn how to become climate designers.